Matt Schaff and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here to help you set your lineups for Week 12 of fantasy football, maybe even beyond that. We're going to talk a good bit about running back usage in this show. Every win matters even more as we get into this stage of the fantasy season. We're trying to fight for playoff spots and then ultimately win our leagues or, bigger tournaments if we're playing something bigger than that. So that just means every lineup decision matters even more. We give it more scrutiny as we're setting our lineups. And that, I think, makes it important to look beyond the fantasy numbers. Obviously, it's always important, and we always do that, but it's even more important this time of year. So we're going to dig into these numbers a little further, see who might be a fraud based on their recent fantasy production and who's just been unlucky. Let's start with the Chicago backfield, Jared. It's the one that led your usage takeaways article this week. And that's because DeAndre Swift saw his second lowest snap share of the season in week 11, the first game after Chicago made its switch at OC. What else do I need to know about what happened with the Bears backfield in that game?
Yeah, it's probably not as bad for Swift as it looks just looking at the box score, but it's still pretty bad. He remained Chicago's pretty clear early down back. Snaps on early downs in week 11 were 37-9 in favor of DeAndre Swift over Roschon Johnson. Carries outside of short yardage situations were 13-5 in favor of DeAndre Swift, but Roschon Johnson dominated passing down and short yardage work. Roschon Johnson played 8 of 11 short yardage snaps. He played 7 of 9 third down snaps, all 6 2-minute snaps. Now, Johnson had been playing a lot of that stuff before. It just kind of shifted even more in his favor. Like, he got a higher percentage of that work. And pass catching stuff and goal line stuff, that's where fantasy points are scored. If you look at expected PPR points last week, DeAndre Swift was RB23. Roschon Johnson was RB17, which again gives you an idea of how valuable those goal line and passing down snaps are. It's definitely an issue for DeAndre Swift. I don't think Roschon Johnson is threatening to become the lead back in Chicago, but he's going to steal some valuable touches from DeAndre Swift. And as we've talked about for a few weeks now, the Bears' remaining running back schedule is pretty brutal. They still have 2 games left against both Minnesota and Detroit. Those are both top 3 defenses in adjusted points allowed to running back. So kind of combined the lost high value touches for Swift with the schedule. And I'm kind of just considering him an RB3 at this point going forward.
Yeah, you will find DeAndre Swift inside our top 24 this week. He's RB20 in the PPR rankings, but it's a 6-team bye week. So running back is missing Bijan Robinson, Alvin Kamara, Breece Hall, Chase Brown, James Cook. So basically all running backs have moved up the rankings somewhere between 2 and 5 spots this week. If all those guys were in there, actually, Swift would probably be outside our top 24. And, it's one game, so we don't want to overreact to a single game where usage shifted, but we're definitely going to need to watch to see if it stays like that this coming week. You said Roschon Johnson doesn't look like a threat to overtake DeAndre Swift, but he certainly looks like he could be some combo of like what Tyler Algier was to Bijan Robinson last year, or what Jaylen Warren has been to Najee Harris over the past couple of years. And that's not great when you're talking about, one, DeAndre Swift, who's been kind of a limited performer in his career, especially as a runner versus a receiver. He was typically more productive receiving wise than rushing wise before he got to Philly last season. So that's not good if Roschon Johnson's taking those kinds of snaps away. And then also a Chicago offense that really needs to prove that it can offer support to its running back production, offer scoring chances, help the team move down the field and just get everybody better touches. So all in all, I think it's a worrisome situation for Swift. That's why I would be looking to sell him off of a game where he did score a touchdown, by the way.
Yeah, Mitch, I think it's a good sell. We should also mention that Swift did not practice on Wednesday with a groin issue. Matt Eberflus said he's hopeful Swift is going to play. So it doesn't seem super serious, but not a lock to play this weekend. And if Swift's out, I think I would assume Roschon Johnson becomes a pretty clear lead back in all situations and would probably be at least as high as Swift is in the current week 12 rankings.
Yeah, would still have a negative matchup with Minnesota. So I wouldn't turn him into like a must play, but he would certainly move up our rankings quite a bit. On the other side of that matchup, we've got Aaron Jones, who had been seeing excellent usage for most of the season, but that changed in week 11, maybe the week before. Jared, what do we make of this backfield?
Yeah, well, week 10, Jones suffered the rib injury and missed most of that second half. He played through it this past week. That's the big question here is was he limited by the rib, or is this, the Vikings plan going forward? Because this past week, Aaron Jones, 55% snap rate, 45% carry share. Those were both his lowest marks since at least week 2 in a healthy game that he didn't leave early. Also had a season low 35% route rate last week. So again, the question is, was it the rib injury that limited him in practice throughout last week? He was left off the final injury report though. So my guess is this is closer to the plan for the Vikings the rest of the season. Aaron Jones has been a committee back throughout his career, throughout his time in Green Bay, unless there were, injuries to the rest of the backfield. He was a, 65% running back in terms of workload. Even if you look at the first 2 games of this season, Jones was kind of in this role where he was getting, 55-60% of the snaps. He had a 46% carry share over the first 2 games. That was alongside Ty Chandler. I think Ty Chandler just wasn't giving Minnesota what they wanted from that 1B role. So they turned Aaron Jones into a workhorse. But now that Cam Akers has been okay for Minnesota, I think they're going to go back to that where it's, more 60-40, 65-35 for Aaron Jones. So he's still going to be a fantasy starter. I'm not really sure what you do with this. Maybe you could try to sell him still if another owner in your league thinks he's going to go back to his previous role. But I think he's going to stay in this role, and that kind of, makes him like a mid-range RB2.
Yeah, I think it's going to be tough to sell him off of 4 straight games without a touchdown. So even if people aren't really paying attention to the usage, tough time to unload him. I also think that guess, from what you said before, is a key word and something we need to make sure we keep in mind, because like you said, it is a rib injury that he has been dealing with. Finished last week as a full practice participant and was off the final injury report, but was also limited the previous 2 days. So it's entirely possible that that injury played into the way he was used in that game. We'll see what the usage looks like this week. I agree that we don't need to panic on Aaron Jones, but we definitely do need to watch the way that he is being used. Minnesota's 8-2. They might not be able to catch the Lions for the lead in that division, but they're looking like they're in pretty good shape for the playoffs. So it certainly makes sense for them to preserve Aaron Jones some, try to make sure he's ready for playoff action.
Jones got the final 3 carries of that game last week with a 10-point lead for Minnesota. So it wasn't like they were, protecting a 1-score game. They still used Jones in that situation. So again, that makes me think that was sort of the plan to begin with. And the other thing we should mention about Aaron Jones too is his efficiency has just kind of gone off a cliff lately. He's averaging just 3.5 yards per carry over his last 4 games. That's down from 5.2 over the first 6. So again, I think, Minnesota might be realizing, the Packers were onto something, making Aaron Jones, more of a 12 to 15 carry per game guy, not 18 to 20 carry per game type of guy. Throw it all together, and that's why I sort of think we're going to see Jones closer to this going forward.
And the Vikings have, for 2 straight seasons, acquired Cam Akers and jumped him ahead of Ty Chandler in line for touches. So clearly they like Cam Akers better than I guess anybody else in the NFL seems to at this point. Another backfield with some usage questions is Pittsburgh. Actually, the question here is kind of the opposite of what it was for the lead backs in the other 2 situations. Najee Harris actually claimed more of the receiving work this past week against Baltimore. That had swung in Jaylen Warren's favor, not to the point where Jaylen Warren was dominating receiving work like we saw last year, but Warren had moved ahead in that area, stayed behind Najee Harris as a rusher. Like I said, though, this past week we got Najee Harris tying for his 2nd most targets of the season, his 2nd most receptions of the season, and the only game in which he had more than 4 catches this year was the week 3 contest that Jaylen Warren left early with a knee injury. So what do we make of this usage for Najee Harris? And then what do we do with it going forward?
This was another backfield where we had one of the guys playing through an injury. Jaylen Warren last week popped up on the injury report on Thursday with a back. He did not practice on Thursday, was limited Friday, then ended up being listed as questionable. My guess here is that the injury did impact Jaylen Warren's playing time, and that we're going to go back to something closer to what we had been seeing. Jaylen Warren is not on the week 12 injury report. The Steelers play the Browns tonight on Thursday night. So I think tonight will give us a good idea. If Harris again controls passing game work, then I would say, that's what we should expect going forward. This is a game too that's probably going to be impacted by weather. So, that we'll have to factor that in as well. But I think Warren will go back to seeing most of the passing network in this backfield. The Steelers actually have the toughest remaining strength of schedule among running backs. Now, if you look at the schedule though, the next 3 games are Cleveland, Cincinnati, Cleveland. Those matchups don't actually scare me. I think Harris and even Warren as, a RB3 flex play will be okay in those matchups. It's really the last 3 weeks, Philly, Baltimore, and Kansas City. Those are 3 brutal matchups for running backs. So that's where I'd be looking to play not use Jaylen Warren, and Najee Harris will probably find himself, more in RB3 territory in our rankings for those matchups.
Yeah, Harris's 63 rushing yards against the Ravens this past week is the most a running back has had against Baltimore this season. So not a matchup you want to play running backs for. I think you can use this window that you just mentioned as a span during which to try to trade Harris, whether that's seeing what the price is now. If you don't find anything now, see if he has a good game against the Browns, try again next week. Cause I agree that span is technically negative by adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs, but it stops short of actually being scary matchups against the Browns and Bengals over the next 3 weeks. You can check the strength of schedule pages by position for the matchups that we're referring to. You can customize it by week. For example, if you want to see who has the best or worst playoff schedule at each position, you don't want to blindly follow the numbers. We just kind of alluded to that with the Browns and Bengals matchups. We'll talk about another key situation on that front later in the show, but it can just be another input as you're figuring out who to use this week, how to plan your roster the rest of the way. So helpful pages there. You can customize them to fit whatever you're looking at. One more backfield to dig into here, Jared, is the Chargers. And J.K. Dobbins looks like a key member of any fantasy team that he's on right now after delivering his second 2-touchdown game of the past 3 weeks against the Bengals. And then the game before that 3-game span, he had 21 touches, a season high, 4 receptions, and a touchdown. So it seems like he's a really good producer right now. But if you look just a little bit deeper, you find that Dobbins has been under 60 rushing yards 4 of his past 5 games. You'll also find that he's tied for 15th in PPR points per game on the season, but just 26th in expected, which points to usage that probably doesn't support the kind of production he's given us lately. What's the problem here and what should we expect from it?
To me, the biggest problem with J.K. Dobbins is the schedule. I think, the usage is not ideal. He's losing more work now to Gus Edwards than he was to Kamani Vidal earlier. Son Haskins keeps coming in at the goal line and, vulturing some of those looks, which again, we are obviously super valuable fantasy. Dobbins is though 17th among running backs in expected PPR points over the last 2 weeks, which is, when Gus Edwards returns. So the usage has been fine. The issue for me with Dobbins is the schedule the rest of the way. It's 4th toughest for running backs. And with Dobbins, kind of unlike the Steelers backs, it's really these next 3 weeks I'm worried about for J.K. Dobbins. Baltimore, Atlanta, and Kansas City, especially Baltimore and Kansas City, 2 of the toughest running back defenses. That's a tough stretch for Dobbins. He does get Tampa Bay, Denver, and New England over the final 3 weeks of the season. Those matchups are okay. I think Denver is obviously the toughest one, but if you can, survive with Dobbins these next 3 weeks, I think he's going to be okay. But he's another potential sell high candidate coming off that 2-touchdown game.
He's also another guy that the Chargers might stand to pull back on a little bit usage wise. Dobbins has been good in that he's been durable and he's been productive enough in his return from last season's devastating injury, but it is a long football season. We're getting toward the end and they now have Gus Edwards back healthy. Obviously not going to take much receiving work away from J.K. Dobbins, but will take some carries. And Son Haskins has factored in near the goal line over the past 4 weeks. Last week against the Bengals, he had 2 shots from the 1-yard line before Dobbins scored his 1-yard touchdown. There was another game against the Saints where Haskins got a shot from the 1-yard line before Dobbins scored a 1-yard touchdown. So that's a couple of touchdowns that could have gone another way besides Dobbins' way that obviously helped his fantasy production to this point. So not a guy that you need to get away from in J.K. Dobbins, but somebody to be a little bit wary of and see if there are sell opportunities on him.
Yeah, sure. Again, especially if you're kind of battling for a playoff spot, I think, these next 3 weeks are going to be rough for J.K. Dobbins starting on Sunday night against Baltimore. It might make sense to flip him for someone who, might be more productive over these next 3 weeks.
Now, all those backfields where we mentioned potential sell candidates, I think that they're all, if you can find good value, you sell this guy, not get rid of him now before he disappears. We're going to move now to a few backfields that are the opposite, where I think it's just time to quit using any of them. Don't expect anybody to really help you the rest of the way. First is Cleveland up tonight. I wanted to see Nick Chubb rebound this season. I hate to see a guy who has been one of the biggest talents at the position lose basically 2 seasons of effectiveness to that knee injury. But that's the case. I mean, he couldn't produce against the Saints. He only got 11 carries in a game that, even though the final score makes it look lopsided, it really wasn't out of hand until the 4th quarter. So there should have been more Nick Chubb. The fact that there wasn't tells me that Cleveland knows he's not close to regular Nick Chubb and that we shouldn't count on any fantasy helpfulness the rest of the way.
Yeah, and Kevin Stefanski said after that game that they kind of limited Chubb in that one because they knew they had a short week coming up for tonight's game against the Steelers. So that's just like the type of stuff the Browns are thinking about, and that's going to continue to impact Chubb's work. Like even tonight in this game that's expected to be wet and windy, like prime healthy Nick Chubb, you probably expecting 20 plus carries out of him, but I just don't think the Browns are going to do that as he comes off the knee injury. Chubb, he did average 4.5 yards per carry last week, which maybe makes it look like he's rounding into form, but that was against a Saints defense that has allowed 5.1 yards per carry to running backs this season. So, Chubb was actually below what the average running back has been doing against the Saints. And he is now losing almost all passing down work to Jerome Ford. And that's especially bad on this Browns offense that continues to be one of the pass heaviest. Chubb also has the 5th toughest remaining running back schedule. Like that matchup against the Saints last week was easily his best matchup of the year. So he is no better than like a low end running back 3 going forward, especially in PPR leagues.
Yeah, I agree. The Jacksonville backfield is another one that doesn't look likely to help you. And we've had some people ask about whether they should drop members of this. And I think it's time that you can go ahead and drop, not that you must drop either Tank Bigsby or Travis Etienne, but the offense sucks. The backfield is split when healthy. And even when Travis Etienne's been getting opportunities, he's been unproductive. No touchdowns since week 2 included in that lack of productivity. So if your question right now is, should I drop this Jaguars back for this other guy that's either going to help me this week or has, high handcuff upside going forward, I say, yeah, it's fine to do that.
Travis Etienne this past week, 74% of the offensive snaps, a 71% carry share, a 10% target share, like awesome usage. He scored 6.3 PPR points. And that came against Detroit, one of the worst matchups for running backs. But Jacksonville has a bye now. They come out of the bye week against Houston. They're 4th against running backs in our adjusted fantasy points allowed. They still have 2 games against Tennessee, a good run defense. There are better matchups in weeks 15 and 16 against the Jets and Raiders, but unless Etienne or Bigsby are out and we can, count on one of these guys to get the vast majority of the backfield work, I think you're better off just staying away from this backfield if you can at all help it.
I think you're also better off staying away from the Denver backfield if you can help it, because they've spent most of the season not giving us much of use between Jaleel McLaughlin and Javonte Williams. And now they've added Audric Estime to the mix as another guy that we can't count on for any level of workload. Sean Payton, after last week's game, conceded that they have 3 running backs now to feed. It's a tough but good problem to have, in quotes. It's not a good problem for fantasy managers to have, because that means the team is going to switch around who's getting the ball, going to go with the hot hand, and we're all going to be guessing, including probably Sean Payton, who gets the ball how many times going into the game.
Yeah, I don't even think this is a game plan thing. I think it truly is a hot hand situation where they're going to, and we've seen it the past couple weeks now. Javonte Williams starts the game, gets the first carry or whatever. McLaughlin's usually the second one in the game. Estime comes in, by the second or third series. And I really think whatever one gets rolling first is going to be the guy that's going to end up leading this backfield and carries. It's just impossible to predict on a week-to-week basis. Again, another one where if you can at all help it, I would just stay away from Denver running backs the rest of the season.
Yeah, Peyton said after last week's game, he got to the end and he was like, we got to get Jaleel the ball more. So if that's what the coach is thinking during and immediately after games, I'm thinking I would rather not use your backfield in my lineup. You can read more about player usage from around the league in Jared's weekly usage takeaways article. That hits the site every Wednesday. You'll see DeAndre Swift as this week's cover boy, the first guy we talked about on this show. Over to wide receiver now. And we'll talk one more time about tonight's game with the Browns wideouts, because they've been so active and useful in fantasy lately. And you'll find all 3 inside the top 36 in our rankings this week, even though they're facing the 4th toughest wide receiver defense by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Are you changing given the weather forecast that we've got? And then I guess beyond this week, what do we expect these guys to do?
The current rankings are, not weather adjusted. We're sort of waiting until we get closer to game time to take a look at that. So, check Shark Bites an hour before kickoff, recheck the rankings an hour before kickoff, because we might end up moving these guys down at least a little bit based on the weather. But yeah, as we talked about on Tuesday's waiver show, just the usage here is insane. I mean, Judy, Tillman, and Elijah Moore are all top 13 wide receivers in expected PPR points per game in the 3 Jameis Winston starts. Like, that's absurd to have 3 wide receivers from the same team in the top 13. Now, weather aside, I think to me, Judy and Tillman are going to be wide receiver 2s going forward, even in negative matchups. Elijah Moore, someone you can consider as a wide receiver 3 or flex, just because the Browns are going to continue chucking it. That's as long as Jameis Winston's under center. If Dorian Thompson-Robinson gets under center, all bets are off, because I think he's a worse passer than Winston, and we might even see the Browns pass rate come down if DTR gets in.
We'll still have projections for everybody, but if they make that QB switch, that'll be like when you see the sports book just take somebody's line off of the board for something that changes in the game. We'll have them in some spot in the rankings, but it won't be be like, this is definitely what Jerry Jeudy's going to do with Dorian Thompson-Robinson. Let's hope that Jameis Winston sticks. I mean, really, Cleveland doesn't have much reason to go with DTR. I feel like they've seen enough of him to know that he's probably not a long-term answer there, right?
I hope so. Jameis Winston's so fun, so nice to have. I mean, it's been a tough year at wide receiver. It's nice to have Winston at least bringing these three guys up in their rankings.
To be fair, I'm sure he's far less fun to have as your quarterback if you're the head coach of a team and trying to protect your job. DeAndre Hopkins has been a long-term answer, but his usage has kind of hidden behind, I think, that second game production that he got after joining the Chiefs. We saw him, get off to an understandably slow start in his first game after the trade from the Titans, but then week 9, Hopkins' second game with the Chiefs, he had 9 targets, 8 catches, 86 yards, 2 touchdowns against the Bucs in an OT game in a primetime slot. So everybody was watching it. Just 7 total catches in 2 games since. And we get plenty of fluky numbers from wide receivers, game to game, even over a couple games in a row. This one's a bit more than a fluke, though. There's something we need to be concerned about here, right?
Yeah, the Chiefs have continued to limit Hopkins' playing time. It came up from 33% in week 8, which was his first game. We kind of knew he'd be limited in his first game. Then it spiked to 69% in week 9. So it was like, oh, okay, we're going to kind of keep heading up from here and he'll be a full-time player. Hopkins' route rate has actually declined the last 2 weeks, 61% in week 10. 54% in week 11. And I wrote in the week 10 usage takeaways that, if the Chiefs were going to unleash Hopkins, it was going to happen in that game against the Bills, because that was a huge game for the Chiefs to really sort of lock up the top seed in the AFC if they'd won that game. But it did not happen. Again, just a 54% route rate. That was with Juju Smith-Schuster returning. So you basically had Hopkins, Worthy, Justin Watson, and Juju Smith-Schuster almost kind of in a 4-man wide receiver rotation. So again, at this point, I kind of think that's what we're going to get. Maybe when we get to the playoffs, you could see the Chiefs just say, okay, screw it. We're going to let Hopkins play, close to every snap because it's do or die time. But I think for the rest of the regular season, he's going to kind of be in this level of playing time, which is, again, what the Titans have been doing with him, because he is, playing through that knee injury that he suffered in the summer. And that obviously makes him tougher to rely on. If we look at the last 3 weeks now, omitting that week 8 game, his first game with the Chiefs, Hopkins has just a 15% target share. He's 30th among wide receivers in expected fantasy points over that stretch. And even that's boosted by that game against the Bucs in week 9. So I think Hopkins, you have to just consider him a wide receiver 3 going forward.
I'd love to say that this smaller than we expected role for Hopkins means greater upside for somebody else here. But I think, like you said, it's not that this one guy is getting this much more because Hopkins is not getting it. It's just more in the pool to go in any direction. Like Xavier Worthy led the wide receivers in playing time against the Bills. Yep. He had a pretty good game there, but he's been just so inconsistent week to week and a lot more down than up in terms of fantasy production. Even the deep balls that he and Patrick Mahomes should be awesome on just haven't quite connected at a high enough rate. Juju Smith-Schuster in his return was just 4th among Chiefs wide receivers in playing time. And Noah Gray's playing time was up as the second tight end in that game. He was near even with Xavier Worthy in playing time. That followed a week 10 game where he trailed 3 wide receivers in playing time without Juju in the mix. They're just mixing everything and kind of either making it work for the matchup heading into the game or making it work as they move through the game. I don't know which it is, but I know that it makes it tougher to predict who's going to help us, if anybody, fantasy-wise.
Justin Watson can definitely be left on the waiver wire. I'm not very optimistic about Juju Smith-Schuster being someone we can count on. Worthy has continued to be the clear leader in pass routes, but even his route rates are like stuck in the mid-70s. He's not like a full-time player. I did think that game last week against the Bills was his best game in a while. He did still have the deep shot down the left sideline where he just didn't get his second foot in bounds. Like, it should not have been a tough catch. That's the second time he's done that over the past 3 games. I'm curious to see if he continues to trend up, though, because he could be someone we're counting on as a fantasy starter the rest of the way, just again as the leader in playing time. But as you said, Matt, he's just continued to be too inconsistent from play to play.
Yeah, he gets more intriguing the deeper your league goes, where you're reaching a little further down the list for players. And if you have steadier wide receivers in your lineup, you can toss them in there as the boom bust guy to either win your week or maybe not kill you, depending on how deep your starting lineup is. Jauan Jennings has stayed more involved as we expected. He's at wide receiver 15 in the PPR rankings this week. Jared, what is the story with him? What do we expect from him going forward?
Yeah, and wide receiver 15 might be too low for Jauan Jennings, what we've seen from him. We look at the 3 games this year where Jennings has ran a pass route on 70+% of dropbacks. So that was the week 3 game, and then these past 2 weeks. He's 4th among wide receivers in expected PPR points per game across those 3 weeks. He's 2nd in actual PPR points per game. Now that, again, includes includes the massive week 3. But even the last 2 weeks, he's finished wide receiver 15 and wide receiver 7 in PPR points. The usage has been there. He continues to play well. Jauan Jennings ranks 5th among wide receivers in PFF receiving grade. He's 5th in yards per route run. He's also 5th in ESPN's receiver tracking metric. So he's just playing well. And again, he's basically in the Brandon Ayuk role. Like, he's playing that spot in the offense. He's getting that level of playing time. He's been earning targets at a higher clip than Ayuk ever has. Now, again, it's just a 3-game sample we're looking at. That's why we're not ranking Jennings as, the top 5 receiver he's been. But it is time to start, saying, okay, maybe this guy is at least on the same level as, Deebo Samuel and George Kittle as far as targets go. I think that at least is fair. And, there might be a chance that Jennings leads this team in targets the rest of the way.
Yeah, 11 targets in 2 straight games. George Kittle will be back this week, but, they've clearly had no issue with using Jauan Jennings this year. Now, if you look at Jauan Jennings as wide receiver 15, you think that's too low. Guys, why should I not start him over CeeDee Lamb this week? You can. I mean, if that's your decision, you can start Jauan Jennings over CeeDee Lamb. The answer to why is he not ahead of Lamb in our rankings is just what Jared said. We're still talking about 3 games in that sample for Jauan Jennings versus several years of him being, a reserve, and CeeDee Lamb being CeeDee Lamb. So that's the kind of decision up in the top 15 you can make individually for your team. I would not fault anybody for chasing Jauan Jennings versus, I guess really anybody up to, I don't know, Puka Nacua at 7. Like, he's got a tough matchup against Philly. I'm playing Puka over Jauan Jennings, but if you're like, I'm going to play Jennings in a better matchup over Puka facing the Eagles, fine. I'm not even going to arm wrestle you on that one right now.
Yeah, it's just great. Like, Brandon Ayuk's a really good receiver, and his targets fluctuated wildly in this Niners offense when everyone was healthy. So it'd be kind of crazy if Jennings was this, consistent high-end target earner the rest of the way, which again is why he sits as low as he does. But the vast majority of fantasy teams that own Jauan Jennings, you're going to be starting him this week.
Right. I think wide receiver 15 is properly respectful of what Jauan Jennings has done this season. TJ Hockenson is going to be confounding, I think, for rankings the rest of the way. We thought a week ago that we might be able to start the Vikings tight end the rest of the way, and then his playing time cratered against the Titans. What are we doing with this?
Hockenson went from a 60% route rate in his week 9 debut up to 71% in week 10, but then down to 57% in week 11. So really tough to figure out. Head coach Kevin O'Connell said Monday that there's no set number on Hockenson's snaps, which I would assume to mean that, it's not the knee injury that's limiting him, but it's tough for me to believe. Why else would you be limiting TJ Hockenson? He's really your second best pass catcher. We'll see. At this point, we're just going to have to wait until he gets back to full playing time. Until then, we're going to have to assume he's going to kind of be stuck in the 60 to 7% route rate. I will be interested to see Josh Oliver, and it's insane to say that Josh Oliver might be impacting Hockenson's playing time, but Oliver has continued to run a route on close to 50% of the Vikings pass plays the last 2 weeks. He is dealing with an ankle injury and did not practice on Wednesday. So I will be interested to see if Oliver does not play this weekend, if that means a spike in Hockenson's playing time.
Yeah, I guess it's nice of Kevin O'Connell to tell us that there's no set number. It seems like a cop-out, but at least it tells us we're kind of judging this as we go. I'm with you. I have trouble believing that it's not a matter of managing that knee. Even if it's not a problem for him right now, I think it's probably a management thing, maybe similar to Aaron Jones. And we'll see what happens as the season wears on. Perhaps jumping to let's start Hockenson weekly the rest of the way after his second game back was a bit more of a too early leap. I think we should probably temper our expectations for Hockenson the rest of the way. Even if he goes out this week and has 10 targets, we can't say, all right, fine, he's back now, let's go ahead and for sure staple him into our lineups the rest of the way.
Yeah, and again, I don't think he's someone like you have to sit at all costs this week, especially against the Bears on Sunday, who are tougher against wide receivers than tight ends. But I would be using the waiver tight ends we talked about on Tuesday, a Jonnu Smith, a Hunter Henry, probably even a Will Disley. I'd be playing over TJ Hockenson this week.
Yeah, I agree, because the upside downside risk calculation on them is different. Like Hockenson, we could just get the same usage that we've gotten 2 of his 3 games. And even that game in between, it wasn't stellar route participation. It was just better than the other 2 games. Whereas the other guys are in good situations, could easily score a touchdown, have been getting good usage lately. So I agree that they're, higher floor options at the very least without sacrificing ceiling.
Yep, agreed.
Now let's close this out with quarterback and talk about our favorite streaming level QB. Jared, I'm going to knock Bo Nix out of contention here. I think he's scoring and rostered at a high enough level at this point that we can't call him a streaming quarterback. So without mentioning Bo Nix, who do you like as a streamer this week?
Yeah, congrats to Bo Nix for graduating out of streamer level consideration.
Big
Pretty
day.
pretty impressive. There are quite a few like solid spot starters this week that sit in like quarterback 10 to 15 range in our rankings. I like Tua Tagovailoa this week. The Dolphins are at home. They have a 26.75 point implied total. That's fourth highest on the week. Only the Lions, Commanders, and Ravens have a higher implied total than the Dolphins this week. They get New England, who they're 18th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, but they're 31st in pass defense DVOA. I actually think this is a similar situation to Miami, where like teams just didn't have to throw much against New England, and it was Jacoby Brissett under center. But now that Drake May's actually made the offense serviceable, I think you're going to see better fantasy production from quarterbacks against the Patriots. It's not a good pass defense, again, as that DVOA would suggest. The Patriots, too, they also particularly struggle defending deep passes. They're 26th in both completions of 20 plus yards allowed and pass defense DVOA against deep passes. So I think this is the week that maybe not Jaylen Waddle, maybe he's just a lost cause, but at least Tyreek Hill breaks off a couple big plays, which obviously buoy to his fantasy production.
And our boy Shane just put out a Dynasty article on Jaylen Waddle today, where he watched the film not only from this year on Jaylen Waddle, but all of last year as well. And that's exactly why we have Shane around, because I'm not spending 3 days watching every single Dolphins game and every single Jaylen Waddle snap from the past 2 years. But that's what Shane's doing. So you can get his analysis on what's been wrong with Jaylen Waddle, and frankly, why he's not like, oh, this guy's about to rebound in a big way. I'm going to go to the other side of this game, and I like Drake May. We've talked about him plenty over the past few weeks. He was rostered in just 24% of sleeper leagues at the beginning of this week, still just 27% rostered on sleeper as of this morning, Thursday morning, despite the fact that May has not scored lower than QB 15 numbers in any of his 5 full outings. He's been a top 12 fantasy quarterback in 4 of those 5 weeks. Miami looks like the second worst scoring matchup for quarterbacks by our adjusted fantasy points allowed, Jared, but 3 of their past 4 opponents have gotten 2+ touchdown passes from their QBs. That includes Gardner Minshew last week, who posted his season high fantasy score, finished QB 13 for the week. I like Drake May this week, and I like Drake May next week, just in case you need to solidify quarterback over these next 2 weeks.
He's just playing really well. Not to get into a dynasty discussion here, but I'm ready to call Drake May the quarterback 2 ahead of Caleb Williams in dynasty from this class. And that's not even to say that I don't believe in Caleb Williams getting it going. I just, at this point, believe in Drake May, particularly as a fantasy quarterback, because he's just an aggressive passer and is willing to take off and run. It's just kind of everything you want out of a fantasy quarterback.
So you got Bo Nix and then Drake May there?
Oh, Nix might be battling Caleb Williams for that 3rd spot. I don't know.
Sure seems like it. But yeah, that's another discussion for another time. If you're in a bind for your starting lineup in redraft or dynasty on this 6-team bye week and need a sneaky starter, we've got multiple tools to help you out. Check your team intel page. That'll guide you to the best starting lineup for your specific format using your roster and your scoring settings. We've got the free agent finder that can highlight any still available week 12 values for your lineup, and even the weekly rankings. You can now customize the numbers on those pages by your specific league scoring system. Just check the top of any page, choose the league. It'll change the scoring to match your specific league. You'll see how all the players stack up against each other in that specific system. Just the latest example of how Draft Sharks can be your unfair advantage.